Welcome to another episode of Not Your Average Lives. And today's guest is Sara Roach Lewis. And the thing that, first of all, I just want to sit in gratitude for a moment and be thankful for Sara because she jumped in and replaced a guest that rescheduled. So I was very thankful for her and her helping me out so I'd not skip a Monday episode. And I just had a great conversation with her. She is very impressive in how she has faced growing an online business from scratch while dealing with a chronic illness. And she talks about the illness and really what changed her and got her to grow is having a new mindset practice. And so we talk about that and what she's done. And I also love the fact that she said, since she's midlife, she started her business at 45 and she's 47 now. But I thought it was really funny that she didn't consider herself midlife until she filled out my form, because I have my guests fill out a form so I can get to know them better. And so she is operating as if there is no such thing as midlife, and I love that. So she's grown her revenue in the past 3 years. She's doubled her revenue each year and lost 75 pounds. So I think she is definitely somebody to listen to and take notes in terms of what she's done. And she still deals with her chronic illness, but she's mastering it and really using mindfulness to do that, and then helping others, because when you go through a journey like she's gone, what you learn as you overcome obstacles is how to help people, and I love that she's doing that. So without further ado, let's get on to the episode. Welcome to another episode of Not Your Average Lives, and I have with me today Sara Roach Lewis. And she is from Canada, and I have a lot of Canadian clients and friends through what I do now. It's great. It's all over the world. It's amazing how we can get in touch with each other. But Sara is a little bit younger than a lot of the people I interview. She is 48. And the funny thing that she said when we connected is that she never has thought of herself as midlife, which I think is amazing, that she doesn't, age never enters the picture for her. But the one quote, and I have to share it, is that she is unapologetically and wildly ambitious. And that is amazing because I think I am the same. So we really relate on that. But one thing about Sara, and I'll turn it over to her in a second to let her introduce herself, but she suffers from a chronic illness that was diagnosed when she was 15, yet she still shows up and serves in a pretty major way. So welcome to the podcast, Sara.
Well, thank you, Lori. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes. And why don't you just start by sharing, you told me before I hit record that you were diagnosed with Meniere's disease when you were 15. And it sounds to me like an illness that would be hard to diagnose. So do you feel like you were fortunate to find somebody who realized what it was? And how do you treat it? And what did you do?
Sure. It is difficult to diagnose. And while I started having symptoms when I was 14 or 15, I was probably in my 30s before it was truly diagnosed. And so, yeah, there's certainly a process. It's an imbalance of the fluid in the inner ear. So it causes dizzy spells, hearing loss, and tinnitus, ringing in the ear. And so it's episodic, so it comes and goes. Certainly the great thing about it is kind of, it's a bit of a light switch. So when I'm not feeling sick, I kind of forget that it's even an issue, right? Like it's really kind of on or off. So I think that's somewhat helpful. And I certainly knew that that's what the issue was. There's sort of a couple of options when I was in my teens and 20s. I had somewhat of a diagnosis. It's pretty rare, so there's no cure. There's not really a lot that's known about it, and there's not a lot of great treatment options.
You probably don't know how long a spell, once you have it, is going to last. Is that true?
Yeah, that's part of it for sure. So and it can be pretty debilitating, and I feel like in the range of people who have this illness, I'm pretty lucky, and it is also can be pretty debilitating. Yeah.
is it attributed to like an autoimmune, or is it genetic, or is there any like, how do you know?
Yeah, so they call it idiopathic, like there's no known cause, no known cure. Um, there's lots of um, there's certainly lots of theories, but because it's pretty rare, it doesn't have a lot of research attached to it.
Right. So, do you notice a pattern in which where, I mean, I know that sometimes I get sick when I don't get enough sleep and I just am stressed or just working too many hours. Also when I travel, because I pick up stuff I think when I travel.
Yeah.
So, have you ever noticed like a pattern where like you have more stress and then you have an episode?
It's so interesting. It's such a great question and one I've noodled on for a lot of times. So I had a 10-year period when my kids were little that I had absolutely no episodes at all. And arguably, raising two small children is a pretty stressful point in your life. So I would say what I am very aware of over time is that having good overall health is helpful and not a guarantee. I also am aware over the last, so I had it when I was younger. I had this blissful period of nothing. And then the last 6 years or so, it's been, I sort of like to think of it as like it's an actor in my life. And so over those last 6 years, there are certainly some patterns. It tends to be more active in the spring and summer months and goes a little more dormant in fall and winter. That's not super consistent, and I can't tell you why. I don't know why that is, but that certainly seems to be the pattern over the last 6 years or so.
So, well, the only thing that I can think of that comes up for me is that's when the allergy season, that's when like the spring, I know people that have allergies in the spring also sometimes have them in the summer. I don't know what it is that happens. I mean, not in the summer, in the fall, but I don't know what it is, but things, people have allergies, they flare up in the spring and the fall. So
Yeah,
almost sounds like maybe that it could be related in some way.
yeah, it
Interesting.
could be.
Let's move on to, so you have your own business, but you didn't start there. And one thing I'm passionate about, and I think a lot of the people who listen to my podcast on a regular basis are people that are really passionate about finding purpose, and some are even looking. And so you had said you started in a not-for-profit, in the not-for-profit sector. And I'd just love to hear kind of your take of your journey and how you went from what you did, and if you were really passionate about that, or if somewhere along the way you were like, no, this isn't, like for me in my corporate job, it's kind of sucking my soul. I call it soul sucking job. Isn't that terrible? But parts of it, I mean, just the latter years were just like a terrible job. And so did you kind of go through that? Did you love what you did and you just thought, well, because you did talk about how your illness played a part in it. So share with me kind of your journey along the way of coming to
Sure.
where you are today.
Yeah, sure. So I worked for a small, not-for-profit, project-based feminist organization, and for many years, and I loved it. And it was a big part of my life. I got to do really amazing things, and when you talk about that core purpose or values, I have known for a long time, it's taken me a while to hone it, but I've known for a long time that my life's work is supporting women to find their voice. I believe that gender equality can solve all of the world's problems, every one of them. I had an amazing ability, and I mean, we're talking, I think feminism. When I started working there in the sort of mid 2000s, wasn't really all that sexy. And things have really evolved over the last number of years, which I'm grateful for. And it was an amazing opportunity. I got to do extraordinary things, work with incredible people. I was part of a team that created a project called Trade Horizons, which was to increase the number of women in skilled trades where I live. We were able to increase that number by 1,200%. That project is in its 13th year now, I think. I worked on a project that was a community response to poverty. I did another project that was really extraordinary and quite a stretch, where here in Canada, we were celebrating 150 years since Confederation a few years ago, and that we talk about the fathers of Confederation, the founders of our country. And so we had this project where we wanted to imagine, what would it look like to have 23 women envision the next 150 years of Canada's future. So we had a conference and published a book of essays, and it was just really amazing. So I had this great opportunity to impact women's lives in the personal and also structurally where we live. We were able to do a lot of work that made significant structural changes. I learned a lot.
I don't know, how old were you when you started working in that job?
33.
Yes. Yeah. What I find interesting is how much, when you talked about values, you clearly at a fairly young age, I'd say, and I wish this was more taught in the school system, but you realize that what you did for your profession connected with who you were and what you believed in and your values. And I think so many of us, I didn't even really dig into my values until I was in my 50s. Like what's important to me. It was always what's important to the company and that mission. It wasn't what's important to my personal mission in life. So tell me about your background when you were a child. Like, I'd love to know what gave you this strong sense of how you wanted to stand up for women. Did you have a mother who was a strong woman, or sometimes it's the opposite that makes you stand for that?
Yeah. So I grew up in a really small town, 1,500 people, tiny province. Now we have about 150,000 people. At that point, it was, maybe 125, really rural. And I would say, my childhood was sort of garden variety dysfunctional, like it was pretty great. I grew up in a fishing family. My dad was a fisherman. My mom fished with him. So I think, where does that come from? Certainly my mother and certainly my grandmothers, they were very different. My grandmothers were very different women. One was a very traditional, apple pie, baking biscuits and sitting on her knee. My other grandmother, we used to call her the Wicked Witch of the North. She would fly in every couple of years with her like strong opinions. But there are strong women who are really smart. And my mom, when I was a kid in the 80s, women didn't fish with their husbands. That just didn't happen. There was sort of a term, women were a scris, so they were bad luck to have a woman on the boat. So there was a real, and in the 80s, there was a movement of women in fishing families to fish with their husbands. It made sense from an economic perspective. We lived in an economically depressed area. If we could keep all of the income from the fishing fleet in our family, that made a lot more sense. It was a really big fight for that to happen. Again, both at the personal level, with people not thinking that was a good idea, and also at sort of structural levels as well, in terms of how money could be distributed and things like that. So my mom, I think she just really taught us, and my dad as well, in a quiet way, to just believe what we believed. They were very free with my sister and I in terms of, and I was just bold. Like I was bold. I was opinionated. I'm raising one of those now. It's very challenging, but they were
interesting, because it sounds to me like your dad supported your mom and what she wanted to do. You made me think of my maternal grandmother, and she was an army wife. Her husband was, and as he grew in the ranks, she uprooted her family and moved from town to town, and she was an alcoholic. Now, she did come from a very dysfunctional family, but it always made me sad, because I thought she wanted so much more for her life. She was really smart, but she never got any credit, and it just was a bad fit for her. Like her soul was not aligned with being a military wife, but that's what she had to do. And so I believe that, like, I feel fortunate that I was born in an age that I wasn't suppressed, because I would have never been happy in that kind of subservient environment.
Yeah,
So,
me
and
either.
I was I had a sister, so my parents were very supportive of whatever we wanted to do. So I love that. Sound like you had a really good environment for letting Sarah be Sarah.
They were very good at that, and I think they might laugh and say they didn't have much choice, but they really were great. And I have a ton of privilege, and I think it's always important to acknowledge that. I from even that family of origin, it was very loving, very wonderful. Lots of things have worked out for me because of the privilege that I was born with, for sure. And I think in terms of that, a commitment to understanding, um, being committed to gender equality and supporting women definitely started at that young age. And I think it's interesting when you talk about how does that progress. So in 2014, I was working at this organization that I loved. I was the executive director. I was paid to be a feminist. I knew how lucky I was, and yet I was feeling really burnt out, and I was feeling really like I need a change, and I don't know what that is. And part of the process that I went through was really unpacking, what is it about this job and this profession and this career that I love, and what is it that is grinding me down. And so it's things like, well, I really value flexibility. Well, actually, what I really value is autonomy. And so, kind of pulling this apart. And part of it was not an easy decision. But what I was able to do is think about, what are my core values? And my core values are, supporting women, gender equality, that kind of, and that the world needs more women's voices. That was my core value, and that's what I worked toward at Women's Network. And what I realized in quite a long process, it took me about a year and a half or 2 years from when I decided I was ready to leave to actually leaving.
Well,
And
this is,
part of that
yeah, it
was
is a lot.
recognizing that I don't have to give up those core values. I can execute those in a different way. And that's part of what helped me be comfortable leaving.
Yeah, and do you think, this is part of my belief, is that we don't stop our day to day and go off on a mountain to contemplate, like, what's best for us. We don't do that, get quiet and ask the soul, which I think is work that needs to be done to really get to that place. And so it does take time, because we're so busy being humans.
Yeah.
And and what probably happened is you got to a point where you spent more time being in that space of, getting in touch with that inner voice. So yeah, world doesn't stop. We keep kind of operating in that. And then I think things escalate inside, that I just need to, the action becomes more of a priority.
Yeah. And I think the big part is making the decision. So once I made the decision, then I just started putting feelers out.
You
And
talked about how your illness played a part in this, and I think that would really resonate with some people who might have illnesses. I mean, we live in a world where there's a lot of autoimmune diseases, and people have flare-ups.
yeah,
So tell me how that was a big factor in this.
yeah. So it was a huge factor. And I think it's interesting in terms of the decisions that we make based on our situation. So I left that not-for-profit. I went to work for a startup in the private sector. First time really in my life that I'd worked in the private sector. And part of kind of the question there was, after having led an organization for a long time, could I work for someone else? And the answer was no. And it had nothing to do with them. Part of it was I was brought on to do a very specific role. I accomplished that. And so at that point, I was really in a position of like, okay, so I know all the places that I don't want to work. And I really fell into entrepreneurship like, well, I guess I'll just go into business for myself. And I hadn't really unpacked what that meant, to be honest. Um, and so once that summer that I really became fully an entrepreneur, it was a little crazy because I was quite episodic at the time, which, in that, what that means in a very practical way is that I was dizzy to the point of being unable to get out of bed for about 4 days a week. 3, 4 days a week. I live in the country. I would get, and I had a pretty good idea of like, there's sort of different gradations of dizzy in my world. Fuzzy means something, and like full on dizzy, and it
Well,
makes
and
me
that can make you
tired.
nauseous too, right?
Yeah, yeah, and really tired. It's very exhausting.
Worst thing ever is being like
Yeah,
feeling nauseous. It's the worst
yeah.
feeling. Yeah. And
So
you have kids that you said they're 13 and 16
yeah,
now. So gosh,
yeah,
being a mom and trying to be there for them.
yeah, yeah. It was not fun. And I have a friend who says the universe whispers and then it roars.
Yeah.
So I was still sort of ignoring what was happening and kind of efforting through and, doing whatever. And I had a little dizzy spell and while I was driving, and I knew it was happening. So I just pulled over, but I basically slowly drove into the ditch. I didn't hurt myself. I didn't hurt the car, but it was the wake up call that I needed. I was close to home. My husband came and got me. Like it was, from a very practical perspective, it wasn't a big deal, but it was a really big deal to me.
Right.
And it was that universe roaring of like,
Yeah.
you have got to get it together, woman. You're like, you got no plan, you're working on your own, but you can't get out of bed. And so I really just made a decision. And the decision was, if I am going to be sick, I just accepted it. It's like it had been a long period at that point. It had probably been about 10 months. And I just thought, okay, this is it. This is what my life looks like. I can't get out of bed for 3 or 4 days a week. I darn well better be at peak performance on those other 3 or 4 days. And so in that kind of, I just decided it within a couple of days of that happening.
You surrendered.
I guess, yeah.
You started coming from a place of abundance instead of lack, and how this was affecting you versus how can I overcome this?
Oh,
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
such a good point. That's such a great point because I spent so much time fighting against that. It was something I felt a great deal of shame about. I mean, the fact that I'm talking to you about this now, most people for most of my life didn't know that I lived with that when I worked for that not-for-profit organization. I felt a great deal of shame, which logically does not make sense, but that is really what I felt. And I felt like if people knew, they wouldn't respect me, or they wouldn't trust my work, or they wouldn't trust that we could do what we needed to do. So
you were damaged goods,
yeah.
Yeah.
And so in that moment, I change, over a period, and I decided, so in my business and the work that I do is really around planning, right? And it's about planning from an entrepreneur's perspective, which is 90 days. So I just decided, okay, this is what my focus is going to be on for the next 90 days. I couldn't even figure out what the tangible goal is. I just thought, this is what I'm focusing on for the next 90 days, is feeling better. And it was in August. So I started walking, and I mean like wobbling around the backyard, walking for 3 or 4 minutes at a time. I started a mindfulness practice, so listening to guided meditations. I live in a beautiful, beautiful place that's an island, so we have gorgeous long, beaches. So I spent a lot of time walking on the beach, listening to podcasts about high performance and, how to be successful. And I changed my diet. And 90 days later, I wasn't dizzy anymore. It doesn't mean that I haven't had periods of that, but it felt like with that plan and with that strategy of focusing on myself first, then that was sort of the first step. I've done a ton of things since then to both internal work and structural work. to make sure that I can coexist in this world in a way that is healthiest for me. But that's how it started.
Yeah, I mean, our paths are very similar, and not that I have a chronic illness, but that I use planning as well to help people find purpose. And so
Right.
you're a stage ahead of that, right? So that's great, and it sounds like you just relied on nature and mindset and magic, like I'm snapping my fingers.
It's funny that you should say that. I do believe there's a lot of magical thinking that needs to happen, and it is. Um, I do employ a lot of magical thinking, and I really think about, law of attraction, focusing on what I want, not what I don't want, and admittedly, that is super hard at times. Like there's no, not to sugarcoat that, it is really hard to focus on the right end of the stick, and it is hard to focus on what you want when you can't get out of bed. And again, I just feel like it's these incremental steps, and it is that focus on, like, that internal work that you talked about not being able to go to the mountaintop. And I haven't gone to the mountaintop, and I spend a lot more time, probably even in 2020 than I have in the last couple of years, really being intentional, really spending that time thinking about what I am designing in terms of my life and my business. Like I believe in terms of the work that I do with clients. I help women build businesses bigger than they can imagine possible, and businesses that work for their life, not businesses, not that we have to kind of have a life that's weaved in around our business. And I think that's one of the things that I've been forced to do that. Like, quite frankly, I've been forced to do that. And
Well, your journey is what you're meant, I think, to share with the world. And it's funny because you said that word intention, and I'm really hyper about this, is that we go around being so unintentional in life. And I pulled a card earlier today. I don't pull cards every day, and it was about intention. And then I was listening to some training uh, while I was doing my carrot ginger soup, and right before I got on here, and the word intention was used. And it's so funny that you just said that, because yes, we need to be more intentional. And you started getting intentional with, once you had that like roaring episode, you start getting intentional with like doing things differently.
yeah,
You said, you didn't even mention this, you said you lost 75 pounds in that.
yeah, I did.
How amazing is that? So
It's pretty fun, yeah.
you're at the
And
mountaintop to you. You didn't
yeah,
need to go to the mountaintop, but it's like within us to be there,
yeah,
get in that space, to get in that headspace.
yeah.
So I also like that you said guided meditations, because I'm like help me, help me. It's like my mind goes in too many weird places when I try to do it myself. So thank God for guided meditations. It doesn't have to be hard.
It doesn't. And I think the thing that I did, and I think as women, we seem to often have an all or nothing mentality, and we have to do it perfectly. And I feel like one of the keys to living, imperfectly in this world is letting go of those shoulds, letting go of the perfection. And I certainly wouldn't call myself a perfectionist, but I definitely had a lot of perfectionist tendencies to get rid of over the last few years. And I think that's a real key. When I started walking for 5 minutes at a time, because that's all I could handle physically, with my head, but also with my body. That was really all I could handle. And with the meditations, I started with, 1 minute guided meditations. And I started slow, and I kind of incrementally moved up, and lots of times slid back. I will say, with the exercise, I am pretty committed to going outside for a walk every day. And I live in Canada, where sometimes it is like, it's just ridiculously cold and windy. So I've loosened up a bit. But that first year, I walked outside every single day, and it did not matter whether it was a blinding blizzard and we had, 2 feet of snowfall in the last 24 hours. I put on my snowshoes and I went outside because I felt like that fresh air. It wasn't even so much the exercise, but I felt like my brain needed the fresh air. And
would
so
you
I,
do, like walking meditations, or and what do you use? I would love to share with the
yeah.
listeners. I always like to give them good tips on things that they can do.
So one of my favorite things around exercise, as I don't really like to exercise, I don't really, I walk a lot, but what I do is pair it with something that I really love, which is talking. So I, right now, since the pandemic started, my best friend, we've been friends since we were 4 years old. She lives, several provinces away. We walk and talk. We have walk and talks. So we walk every morning for an hour and talk on the phone. And that's what inspires me to walk, is a podcast or talking. And so there, in my day, if I'm doing a phone call, I almost always do that while walking. That is just one of those things that I've paired. And so I'm not like walking at breakneck speed, but I'm just moving my body, getting that fresh air. And I just find like it helps me think as well. So that's what I do for walking, and how I continue to feel inspired to do that. In terms of meditation, I do a number of different things. Like, so in the beginning, I just used Insight Timer, which is an app,
I've
which is
recommended
great.
that. I recently, well, I interviewed somebody on my podcast, and she is a coach on there, and I hadn't heard of it, and it's got a lot of free content.
Yeah. Yeah. So I used Insight Timer. Interestingly, so my parents taught us transcendental, or we all learned transcendental meditation, TM, when I was like 11. So like in the 80s, I mean, really, they're so extraordinary. And so my mom and her sister and all of our families all learned TM. So meditation was something that was always part of my life. I knew how to do it since I was a kid, but I was never, I mean, really, when you're 11 or 12 and your parents, teach you to do something, it's not high on the priority list, but it was always part of my toolbox. And I always went to meditation, that kind of TM, when I was stressed, when I was worried, that it was something that I used, but not consistently. So I spent a year and a half probably doing the guided meditations. And then I thought, well, I know how to do this. I just need to kind of relearn. So interestingly enough, the guy who taught me to meditate 40 years ago checked my meditation for me via Zoom. I don't know, probably about a year, September 2019. He was in India, in this wild world of Zoom. We met, he checked my meditation. He kind of helped me remember. And I did TM for a year. And so the interesting thing is, again, in terms of how these things ebb and flow, I kind of just randomly stopped doing that in the summer. So I did it for probably about a year. Then I stopped, and then I was mad at myself, right? And so then you're like, kind of, and trying to effort back to the 20-minute meditations. And so I did that for a couple of months and just kept getting irritated with myself. And then finally I was like, okay, why don't I just go back to the guided meditations? So that's what I've been doing for the last couple of months, is just back to the guided meditations, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah. And I think we go, as you said, ebb and flow. We go through these periods of, I'm good. But then you stop doing it and you realize how much you really need that, and continue to do it. And it really does open up that, if only for 10 minutes a day, because I do the 10-minute ones, it just opens up that conduit to the, just like making me quiet. Because I tend to be like busy as my comfort zone. And so I have to really consciously turn the world off. And sometimes it's hard to do. It really takes intention.
So, it does.
Yeah. So any mindfulness, as we close up, any mindfulness, like anything that really stands out in terms of helping you when you were doing those initial walks on the beach? I know I went to a Tony Robbins event. I went to his Unleash the Power Within, and I don't think I've ever even talked about this, but I was a beach body coach at the time, and a big group of us went, and there was like 9,000 people in the room. That's how big it was. It was a
Amazing.
4-day event. And the first night after he did his first session with us, and it wasn't even till like midnight. And it's one of these things where you're in this big conference center with him. Again, he's on stage. You're looking at these monitors most of the time, but you were supposed to bring a coat because he has it so cold. So it's almost like he gets you into this place in your mind, and then he teaches you how to go walk on those hot coals. 9,000 people. That's how like organized this event was. And we went outside. I think it was the Los Angeles Convention Center. We walked outside, and there was everybody lined up. I mean, it was a zillion of these. I don't even know how many, 100 at least of these little, I don't know, 4x6 burning coals. And they had people tending to the coals. And I friggin' walked over hot coals after just one session with him of explaining what the mantras and what to do when you do this, and your mind is powerful and you can do anything. And it was crazy. I mean, people did get blisters. I don't know how he gets away with it. We must have signed some sort of a thing, but the person that I was with, she and I were just randomly roommates because we needed a roommate, and she felt rushed through it. And then she looked down. He says, don't look down, look straight ahead, repeat the mantra. And so she got totally off what she was supposed to do. And she got blisters. So I'm like, it's crazy. That really inspired me to, when I didn't know a lot of stuff at the time, it opened me up to the possibilities of what the mind can do, how powerful the mind is. So I don't know if you were exposed to him in any way. I know he's really, a lot of people have really had amazing kind of change direction in life because of that particular conference or whatever it's called. And now I think he's been doing it virtually with the pandemic, but yeah.
That's incredible.
And it's not cheap, but it's interesting. He really is an incredible human being in terms of what he can do with people in a very short amount of time and get them to switch their thoughts and realize what's holding them back.
A book that I read not that long ago that I really liked is called The Big Leap with Gay Hendricks, I think his name is. So it's an old book. It's been around for a long time, but I found it really helpful in terms of, kind of that next level. But I think, certainly that sounds amazing. And I also think we're just in a world right now where just Google mindfulness and just Google, go to YouTube University. There's all kinds of stuff on there that is a good starter. I think it depends on where you want to end up, but there's lots of places where you can start from the comfort of your own living room without, and these days we can't really go all that far anyway, but it doesn't prevent us from finding these things. And I think that that's probably a good place to start. And I think I've really discovered the joy of journaling these days, which is not something. I'm an extrovert. I just like to talk to process. But I think, again, the older I get, the more reflective I become. And so I think that's been really helpful as well in terms of sifting and sorting what's important.
Yeah, so true. So true. And I would just say, like, look for somebody who like makes you feel good, because everybody, there's some person that is a good, that you could click with. Whereas some, I've followed some people and then I'm like, so, but there's always somebody that's going to be perfect for you, that is going to just look for people that can open up your mind. I guess that would be a great thing. I'm constantly wanting to grow, and I find my guests are like that. I see that you're like that, and how great that is for your kids to see what you're teaching them as a mom is amazing.
Thanks. I also think, just to sort of follow up on that, I also think we often know the answers ourselves.
Oh, yes.
And that sometimes it's, and I think what happens with those things, finding those people, is they help you figure out, they help you find the path to your own stuff. But it's been an interesting path and I think for me, my first year in business, I like to call it a crisis of confidence. Like, it was all a crisis of confidence. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have confidence that I didn't know how to sell. I didn't, so many things were swirling. And that crisis of confidence, I mean, the joy of that is it means you have confidence. It's just rattled. And the piece to that was just really, the sift, the sort, the sift, the sort to figure out. And once I realized that I was the boss, I could do what I wanted in my life and in my business, that evaporated. But it took a long time because I kept looking to other people to tell me what to do in my business. And once I realized that, well, actually, I get to make all of those decisions because I'm the one who knows best, that's what really helped drive that particular piece forward. So it's a little bit different than what we were talking about, but I think it's that same message.
Yeah, I love that. What came up for me when you're talking about that is that we know what inside of us, we have all the answers. And one thing that I heard recently, which I love, is that never say, I don't know, say it's unfolding. Because when you say, I don't know, you shut off the options of your mind coming up with the answers. And so when you say it's unfolding, it's like, it's there somewhere. And I just have to like wait and be patient and it will come. But I think also you had so much success in your, we tend as women, particularly, I think women are guilty of this, is we always tend to look at what we didn't do versus what we did do. And you clearly had a lot of evidence of things that you accomplished. And then you start to realize I can lean on that. If I did it then, I can do it again in a different way. And I see that you've done that really well.
And I think that's a key to people who are listening and, maybe aren't feeling great right now for a variety of reasons. And part of that is we've all done hard things. We've all gotten through hard things before. And part of this path is remembering that and knowing that, this too shall pass and you have gotten through hard things before and you can do it again.
Yeah. Yeah. And reframe it that hard things are actually really valuable, right? Because they teach us even more how strong we are. So amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming here and sharing your story. And it's just amazing. I think that it's wonderful that you got that roar and that it was you were surrendered and here you are serving in the world in a big way and doing exactly what you wanted and having that autonomy that was so important to you.
Well, thank you. This has been a delightful conversation.
Yes, I agree. All right. Well, thanks.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Not Your Average Lives podcast. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe on iTunes if you have an Apple device. You can find free resources and learn what else I have going on at the moment that might interest you on my website at notyouraveragegrandma.com. You can also find me on Instagram or Facebook at Not Your Average Grandma. If you liked this episode, it would make my heart so happy if you could leave me a 5-star rating. You can also add a review to let me know what you like about this podcast, which will help spread the word about it to others who need a little midlife inspiration. As always, be you, listen to your inner voice, and focus on reigniting that lost spark so you can start living your own, not your average life.